Very few things motivate me like a good question, and here's one. So, in court cases, if all the witnesses' testimonies corroborate the defense, wouldn't it increase the validity of the claims in the eyes of the judge and jury? So, it depends on how you look at it. So, think about it like this way. If you have four different witnesses, right, and the four different witnesses come into the court, and even though they corroborate the validity of what the defense is saying, all of them have the exact same story down to a T. You're not going to believe that these are four independent witnesses. You're going to believe, particularly if you learn that, hey, once they all came up to the police station and say, hey, I saw said event, you're going to, and they all put them in the same cell and say, hey, okay, hey, everybody, wait over here. I'm going to interview y'all one by one. And then all of them have the same story. People are going to say, oh, all they did was copy one another's story. And now what happens is the minute differences and everything like that in perspective, when put all together, can help corroborate and demonstrate the validity that what they saw from different perspectives, they're all seeing the same thing. And so that's what we see when we look at the Gospels. Even though we know that Mark was the first one written and that Matthew was aware of Mark's Gospel and that Luke wrote afterwards, what we don't see is them, even though they call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic Gospels. But what you don't see, even though they're telling a lot of the same stories, they're not telling them the same way. Let me show you how this works, okay? All right, so here's a good example, right? Mark, assuming he writes first, he is kind of telling this straightforward passage, right? Now, what Matthew does is he adds in elements that are significant for a Jewish audience that he is trying to demonstrate to them that Jesus is the Jewish king, that he is the Messiah, the king of the Jews. So what does he do? He adds in that when Mark is talking about the place that it ought not to be, he's filling in the blanks for the audience that is talking about Jerusalem. Whereas he also says that this was spoken of by the prophet Daniel. All right. So again, why is that important? Because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the things that the prophets talked about in the Old Testament. So these things are pertinent to his Jewish audience. For Luke, in a Gentile audience, that was not significant. So while he lets them know that this is talking about Jerusalem, he doesn't feel the need to add in the parts about it being spoken of by Daniel. And that is one of the things, a lot of times in class, we were talking about how we rush to fill in all of the blanks. But in doing so, even though it's not anything necessarily bad, we can miss the intent of the author and the specificity of what they were speaking to their particular audience. And so it's best to read it in the context of how they wrote it for their audience. That's where the importance of this. I want to show you one more example. Now, how were the words of Jesus being communicated to people prior to the Gospels being written? They were being passed down in pericopes. All right, that is like a section or a group of teaching. And so we'll see this often in Paul's writings because they were the first ones that were written prior to the Gospels. We'll see that there were certain things that were written and they were in pericopes, they were in sections. We don't see that oftentimes in the way that we read them in our English translations because we have chapters and verses. But a lot of times, a pericope of teaching can be one particular chapter or it can be several chapters. Let me show you how that's broken up. All right, so in this chart, you can see 5 different pericopes of teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. And so Matthew 5 through 7 is one pericope. At the end of that section, Matthew ends by saying, when Jesus had finished these things or finished saying these things, then he goes on to a different set of teachings. It's not until Matthew 10 that he gets into another pericope, and that is all in one chapter. So you can see Matthew 10, Matthew 13, Matthew 18. That is one pericope of teaching. But then the last pericope is in Matthew 23 through 25. So are we understanding the full context of that pericope of teaching if we're only looking at Matthew 23, but we're disregarding or we're not adding in what's said in chapter 23, 24, and 25? Because again, if we're trying to understand the Gospels as they were written to their audience, then they were written in pericopes. Let me show you this in the life of Paul. Now, this will help you. It definitely helped me, right? So Paul is known for giving us like what we call a pronouncement story. He'll give us what I like to call a one-hitter quitter line, right? But we don't know the full context of it. So for instance, he says here, not I, but the Lord says, and then he says, a wife is not to leave her husband. We see that Paul says that just that line in 1 Corinthians 7 and 10. Later, Matthew comes back and writes his gospel, and he gives us the full context of where that line comes from in Jesus's teachings. Imagine what it would be like to just have that one quotation, but not the full context of the story that went behind it. In the example of that is we have this saying at the end in Acts 20 and 35, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. But we don't have a gospel story or a narrative that fills in the blank of what pericope of teaching that came from. So what we see is that these pericopes were being passed down and they were known to the people in Paul's time, but it wasn't until the gospels came back later and they filled in the details of the narratives of the stories from which these things came from. Last example, Luke says in 15 and 1 through 3, and the tax collectors and sinners were approaching him, listening to him. The Pharisees and scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And he told them this parable, right? But Jesus doesn't just tell one parable, he tells three. He tells the parable of the lost sheep, tells the parable of the lost coin, and what we would call the prodigal son. So if Jesus is telling three parables back to back to back, is there something that we miss that he's trying to communicate to the original audience that we would miss by only telling one parable? I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying that it's worth the thought that just maybe perhaps if Jesus gave this as one, or excuse me, as if Jesus gave it and Luke presents it as one pericope, not as three separate parables to be written or to be told independently, but Jesus tells them all at the same time. Luke presents them as one pericope. Maybe we gain something by telling them and teaching them as one pericope, because I believe that the full context of what Jesus is trying to communicate is seen when we look at all three, not just one. Because I believe that in Jesus's omniscient mind, that there's a reason that he told three. If he could have gotten across what he wanted in just one, then he would have just told one. But there's a reason that he told three. So it's just even me. I am deconstructing and reconstructing, attempting to understand the Gospels and the Bible in its context. And in the Gospels, as we see, that understanding and teaching in pericopes, that maybe there's something that we see there if we teach it in the same way that it was taught. So just food for thought when it comes to the Gospels, and hopefully this helps you to understand why we have four Gospels instead of just one, and the necessity and how they help the credibility of the scriptures. So long-winded preacher video, but I'm a teacher. I love y'all. Blessings.